Yeah, thank you, Adriana, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar that CRA is presenting on Inflation Reduction Act energy communities, and in particular the opportunities and challenges that arise from the Treasury and IRS notice that came out last week. So before we start, just do a couple of brief introductions. My name is Pat Augustine. I'm a vice president in CRA's energy practice based in our Washington, D.C. office, and spend most of my time working with our electric utility and project developer and investor clients, particularly in the power sector. So my background is largely on utility strategy, integrated resource planning, and power market advisory. And before going through the agenda here, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ryan Iyer, to provide a quick introduction of himself.
Hi, everyone. Ryan Iyer here. I'm an associate at our DC office as well. Much of my work involves supporting utilities, developers, and investors on the strategic implications of energy policy. So most recently, that's meant the Inflation Reduction Act, looking at things like the Energy Community Clause, which we'll be talking about today, but also broader implications of the law, such as SAF credits, the hydrogen production tax credit, and low-income community programs as well. I also work on some diligence work for renewable transactions and perform electric power system modeling as well. So looking forward to exploring this more today.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And we are looking forward to spending the next hour or so walking through the energy community guidance that came out. For the rest of the session here, we'll provide a brief overview of energy communities, defining the opportunity in general and why they matter. Then I'll turn it over to Ryan to go through the meat of the presentation here, where we'll provide some updates on the notice that came out last week, starting with key findings and overall guidance takeaways. We'll go through the cold closure category, the Brownfield category, and the statistical area category, otherwise known as the fossil fuel employment. And then kind of close out the session by providing some forward-looking perspectives on how energy community qualification might change over time. So as Adriana mentioned, we've got a Q&A feature. Please feel free to use that. We've already received some questions that came in through the RSVP link that you had the opportunity to ask some questions there. So we've got some queued up already, but we do want to leave 10-15 minutes towards the end to make sure we hit on some of the key questions. So if you have any, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we'll be tracking them, and we'll come back to them towards the end. So without further ado, let's dive into things. So before we get into the details of the Treasury guidance that just came out, wanted to level set the group here and provide an overview of the three major categories of energy community qualification under the Inflation Reduction Act. So many of you are probably familiar with this already, but the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, provides an opportunity for renewable, clean energy storage developers to receive bonus tax credit opportunities, both for the investment tax credit, the production tax credit, under three major categories. One we're terming here the coal closure category, based on the initial Treasury guidance and CRA's own analysis internally. That probably opens up about 15% of the land area in the US to this bonus opportunity, because that land is in close proximity to retired or retiring coal plants or coal mines. The geographic extent that you can see in that graphic on the left here is largely confined to big swaths of PJM, the West, and parts of MISO. And I think we've got some pretty good guidance from the Treasury Department on the data sources, but as we'll talk about in a few minutes, there's a lot of uncertainty on some of the key questions on what we'll term some edge cases or uncertain definitions, and there's also some errors that appear to be in the track data set that was provided. So we'll go through that in a little more detail. In the middle, the statistical area category, sometimes referred to as the fossil fuel employment category, probably provides the most opportunity. A quarter to a half of all land in the US could potentially qualify, but this also has a lot of uncertainty. As we'll talk about in a little while here, there's time dimension uncertainty, but also a lot of data uncertainty even after the guidance. So Ryan will talk a lot more about the details here, but we've been unable to replicate the IRS or Treasury guidance in specific detail, and there may be some follow-up justification or clarification that's needed on how the qualifying areas were defined themselves. And then finally, over to the right, the brownfield category, a lot less land area, but actually a lot more clarity from the original guidance. And this might be an area where there's some interesting opportunities for smaller scale projects to site on brownfields and receive the bonus credits. So why does this matter? I think at the crux of it, it obviously lowers costs and provides federal subsidies on top of the extended ITC and PTC to projects that are sited in these relevant geographies. So from a utility perspective, lower PPA price opportunities, lower cost of service, potential improved regulatory outcomes from finding beneficial projects that are further subsidized by the government. And similar from a developer investor perspective, lower revenue hurdles, better IRR, competitive PPA positioning and competitive procurements, and a potential interesting impact where if you're moving towards the production tax credit in particular, now that that's opened up for solar, reduce curtailment risk if you're able to offer into wholesale markets at a lower or more negative price than other resources that may not have a tax credit in general, or if you're a bonus eligible project, you have a higher tax credit than others that don't have that bonus. So on that point, we actually did get a question that came in, which I think is an interesting one about, how does PTC versus ITC selection impact wholesale power prices? And I think this is one of the angles that we'll be tracking. As you move to the PTC, and as you move to a PTC that may have a bonus eligibility, you could have a higher opportunity to offer negative bid prices into the wholesale market. So something to track for those that monitor and model power markets. So into the details here on the bottom, for those not familiar with the rules themselves, the bonus credits associated with energy communities offer an additional 10% investment tax credit, so a 10% haircut effectively to the capital cost of a project, and a 10% adder to the value of the PTC, which right now represents about $2.75 for every megawatt hour produced over the first 10 years of operation. So we're seeing that projects likely with higher capacity factors and more megawatt hours are going to prefer that PTC opportunity, but there's a wide range of outcomes for PTC and ITC selection. And if we go to the next slide, what we're illustrating here is that extra layer of bonus credit opportunity can potentially change your decision from how you view the ITC versus the PTC. So illustratively here, you've got some assumptions to the right, just for reference, and we're looking at where across the country the PTC or the ITC may be preferred by developers or utilities or investors when they're looking at project economics. And it all comes down to several trade-offs: capacity factor, capital cost. All else equal, the higher the capacity factor, the better the PTC. The higher the capital cost, the better the ITC, because it's a credit on the capital cost itself. But when you layer in the potential for energy community bonuses or domestic content bonuses, which we don't cover here, that calculus could change because the bonus, that 10% adder to the ITC, is more impactful than the PTC. So the graphic here, using some generic costs for solar, generally in the order of $1,500 to $1,800 a kW, reflective of a lot of projects going into service now, although we're continuing to see escalation in costs in the market, shows some of those trade-offs and where this could play a really interesting role in developers or utilities making decisions about how to select the tax credit to take, and if pursuing an energy community bonus is going to impact that decision. So hopefully that provides a little bit of guidance just on the details behind the tax credits themselves and why it matters here to why energy communities can provide a new perspective. So I'll turn it over to Ryan to now dig a little bit deeper into the IRS notice that came out last week and some of the key findings across those categories.
Yeah, thanks, Pat, for teeing it up. This is going to be a fairly long section. We have a lot of information here going through the weeds, um, but I'll try to be brief on the specific details and bring out high-level key takeaways from each of the guidance provided for each category. But that being said, if you do have questions on some of the minutia or something specific that wasn't covered in depth, feel free to drop that in the Q&A, and we'll try to cover it at the end. So just taking the high-level view, guidance certainly provided more clarity, but we think more will still be required. Most importantly, dates and timeline were established, so you have an understanding of how safe harbor and place in service date will impact your qualification. Secondly, the definitions themselves were further refined, so we got data sources and methodology from the Treasury. However, there were still errors that we identified, and that may be some of the most surprising findings from our initial review of the guidance. There were also clarity on the non-standard edge cases, things like offshore wind or projects built on qualification boundaries, and we'll cover those in depth. Finally, guidance was also provided on how to deal with some of this uncertainty, but not all of it. They particularly note that the EIA and MSHA should be contacted rather than the IRS or DOE if you have a dispute with some of the underlying data findings. But we don't really have clarity on whether some of the other errors we identified will be changed or if there are going to be substantial updates to this methodology. So to quickly go through the broader findings before we dive into each category, I think one of the most important things people are asking is, how does the timing of your project construction impact qualification? And this will be different for the ITC and the PTC. For the ITC, you essentially have two chances. If your safe harbor date is after Jan 1st of 2023, and your project is located in an energy community at that time of safe harbor, your project will qualify. However, if it's not an energy community at time of safe harbor, but it is during your place in service date, you can also qualify as an energy community. For the production tax credit, you really only get one chance, which is if your beginning of construction date is after January 1st of 2023, and your project is located in an energy community at that time, your project will qualify for the entire 10-year credit period. If it's not an energy community during that BOC date, then qualification will be determined separately for each taxable year. So this could increase the risk of electing the PTC if for a given project, you could qualify via the ITC, but it's not certain that during your place in service date, it will qualify for the PTC. And we can cover some questions later if that doesn't fully make sense. And then secondly, this is a pretty standard guidance that we saw. Basically, your project has to have at least 50% of its capacity in an energy community to qualify. And this essentially prevents mega projects from citing a small portion of their project on a brownfield to receive qualification for the entire site. But we do note that offshore wind was importantly allowed an exception where their land-based point of interconnection can be used to determine if it's an energy community because there's no census tracts in the water. So that was an important clarification and a potential benefit to that industry. So now I'll dive into the categories. Again, there's going to be a lot of detail here that might not be relevant to all viewers, but I'll try to be brief on getting into the weeds and kind of try to highlight the key takeaways. So as Pat mentioned, this relates to coal mines and coal-fired generating electric units. The coal mines have to be retired after 1999 and the electric generating units after 2009. And this category applies to census tracts with those pieces of infrastructure as well as adjoining census tracts. We thought the guidance here was fairly strong. We now have an understanding of the data required to map these extents, as well as refinements within those data sets. But the crux of the issue here is those data sets are flawed. And because of that, there may be uncertainty going forward as to whether or not a given project will qualify under this category. So to dive in a little bit further, for coal mines, as we proposed to the Treasury, the MSHA database was used. And if a mine is placed in that database with a status update date after 1999, it can qualify if it's either an underground or surface mine. listed as abandoned or abandoned and sealed. We note that non-producing mines were not included, which we thought were likely to actually represent a closed mine, and also mining facilities were not included. However, the MSHA database has a lot of errors, particularly with latitude, longitude misplacements, and the guidance states that the MSHA should be contacted directly to resolve those errors. As far as remaining issues, we have the non-producing mine issue, the incorrect location, and also issues with mines that overlap multiple tracks, as only one point can be associated with a mine, which would lead only one track to qualify, even if it is actually associated with multiple. And so to dive into that point a little bit deeper, we have a GIF here, basically trying to show that strip mines can be quite large and can cross track boundaries, and they also move over time. So representing them as a single point may not be the best idea and may reduce the total extent. A potential solution for the MSHA is to consider incorporating polygon data to allow further areas to qualify, as oftentimes it can feel arbitrary why one county or tract would qualify while the other would not. The example we show here is a mine in Texas that straddles county lines. You'll also note that this is a non-producing mine, but a quick Google search shows that it had actually closed and is undergoing environmental remediation, further driving home the point that not including non-producing mines may not be an accurate reflection of the set of retired coal mine infrastructure in the US. And on the point of errors in location, these aren't expansive, but there are significant errors in the MSHA data set. So you can see here in blue and red are potential areas where the existing maps could be incorrect or where new areas could be added. A good example is the Kayenta mine in northern Arizona, where we identified that it overlapped a tract that would allow a significant portion of northern Arizona to qualify. But at this time, the IRS methodology would not allow for that region to qualify. On the coal-fired electric generating unit side, these are essentially units within power plants. The EIA 860 dataset was used, which we also recommended for the Treasury. And we list the qualifying technologies below. But the key point here is that it has to be characterized as coal-fired at the time of being listed as retired. And this could create issues for plants that convert technology types. There also are some issues with location data in the EIA 860, but we find they're much more accurate than the MSHA. And again, guidance recommends that taxpayers coordinate directly with the EIA rather than the IRS to resolve these issues. There also are some instances of tract overlap with these electric generating units, but it's much less common. I think the key uncertainty we had with this electric generating unit was this issue of coal to gas conversions. Over 100 coal-fired plants have converted to natural gas, but because they have to be listed as coal-fired at the date of retirement, if they switch to natural gas and subsequently retire, they will never have a chance to qualify or allow the tract they're located in to be deemed an energy community. And so this presents a bit of a legal paradox, and we think should require some further clarification or guidance to resolve this issue. The key takeaways are that we have good data sets and methodologies defined for these coal closure categories, but key edge cases remain. So having a deep understanding of the MSHA and EIA data sets can really help de-risk your project if there's a chance that it may not qualify or it could qualify under a better view of the data. We'll just note quickly that for securing tax equity arrangements, because of the uncertainty, having this underlying data could be helpful. And we list some other takeaways, which we'll share these slides later, so I might not cover everything in the interest of time, but please feel free to reach out or if you have questions or want to explore more. So moving on to the brownfields category, this to me was one of the most exciting findings, and the guidance here was really strong. We give it 3 green check marks as they gave us clear data sources, clear pathways for sites with data limitations, and there are accurate public data sets for brownfields. The key takeaway for what a brownfield is it's a property whose redevelopment may be complicated, by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substance, pollutants, or contaminants. But it's important to note that the IRA definition of a brownfield is not the same as the traditional EPA definition. They include more exclusions and it's a bit more narrow. So the existing data sets will have to be scrutinized to make sure that the site you're building in doesn't hit one of those exclusions. But overall, I think we have very clear guidance on what brownfields are and how they can qualify. Just going into the actual definitions, there's two ways a site can qualify as a brownfield. The first is if it was previously assessed in an EPA brownfield program or a state, territory, or tribal program. And those sites exist in an interactive map that can be accessed there below. However, as we noted in our comment to Treasury, the majority of brownfields have never had a site assessment conducted and so go untracked under current guidance. So it's not very clear how many of these opportunities exist. And they allow those potential sites to qualify through the environmental site assessment pathway. For projects under 5 megawatts, a phase 1 site assessment has to be conducted, which doesn't require chemical monitoring. It's actually a relatively straightforward assessment, and they don't require there to be a confirmed presence of a hazardous substance. So this could potentially mean that as long as the site assessment is conducted, the entire site could qualify. And that may need some other clarifying guidance, as it seems that it would be too easy to qualify as a brownfield under this current guidance. But for projects greater than 5 megawatts, a phase 2 environmental site assessment has to be conducted. And that's a bit more detailed and requires chemical monitoring. It also requires the confirmation of the presence of hazardous substances. Overall, though, if you have an understanding of which types of areas are likely to be brownfields, before conducting these assessments, you can sort of develop a set of maps or a strategy to identify these sites prior to making the site assessment investment. And that could open up a lot of new area to qualify as an energy community. So overall, we think this is very important for the storage industry. Brownfields will become a fundamental component of energy storage siting for two reasons. The first is because they are very geographically dispersed, and they're also located in many industrial areas that may have access to transmission. Although certain brownfield categories, such as mine-scarred lands, may not have as ready transmission access, which could limit the opportunity. However, if you're thinking from the perspective of a developer who's looking to build storage in a city, maybe for a non-wires alternative program, it's not difficult to find a brownfield and conduct that site assessment to get this 10% energy community adder. So it very well may be that it's sort of the norm rather than the exception for a brown or an energy storage project to qualify as an energy community, allowing storage to access 40% ITC off the bat. But again, we still aren't environmental experts at CRA, so potentially these site assessments could be more strict and further diligence needs to be done. Particularly, we recommend meeting with an environmental consulting organization that has regional expertise to understand the scope of opportunity. And we've been chatting with a couple groups and are happy to, facilitate those arrangements later down the line if that's of interest. And for the last section, I'm going to cover the statistical area category. This is definitely the trickiest one out of the three, but as Pat mentioned, it covers the most land area. So diving into what it actually is, we only cover the statistical area category from the perspective of direct employment. There's another way to qualify through tax revenues. However, the IRS did not provide guidance on that pathway, and they are actually requesting new comments because there are not a lot of data sets for local area tax revenues related to specific industries. But to provide a definition of what this is, statistical areas are defined as MSAs, which are metropolitan statistical areas, or non-MSAs, which have had it at any time after 2009 greater than 1.17% direct employment, related to the extraction, processing, transport, or storage of coal, oil, or natural gas. The MSA must both satisfy that requirement, but in addition to that, it must have had an unemployment rate at or above the national average unemployment rate for the previous year. And we'll get into what the previous year means. Key takeaway here is that the guidance did not show us a lot about what it actually means to be a statistical area. They did follow our proposed methodology using specific data sets that we outlined in our guidance with specific refinements. But it's difficult to identify some of the data sources that they mention, and there's not very clear justification for either their methodology or a clear pathway to replicate their methodology, which we'll discuss later. So our current thought is that the current maps we're seeing from the DOE are not final. Errors that we identified in the direct employment calculations and a lack of justification in their overall methodology makes these maps more tenuous in our view, but it could be that this is the final guidance, and despite errors, these locations will persist. So to dive in first at that direct employment clause, the way they define it was, again, using a similar methodology that we outlined using the county business patterns dataset. MSAs are basically collections of counties, and the county business pattern dataset can be aggregated for each MSA by finding total employment by NAICS code. And NAICS codes basically represent industry groups. So they list, I believe, 8 different NAICS codes, which can be used to calculate the direct employment. But we found this approach to be rather narrow. In most of the comments to Treasury, far greater number of NAICS codes were included, and many of them seem like common sense industries that relate to the definition you see there in orange. So this was a bit of a surprising result. As you can see there on the right, those are not NAICS codes that the IRS provides, but there's some that we flagged as highly likely to adhere to that IRA verbiage. We'll go into petroleum wholesalers in this next slide, but natural gas distribution, that mainly is looking at LDCs. Things like oil and gas pipeline construction seem very clearly to align with that definition. And there was no rationale behind the IRS's inclusion of only those 8 NAICS codes. So it would be nice to see in future guidance a rationale for including or not including key fossil fuel categories. And just diving in deeper to one of those specific NAICS codes to show why there may have been missed opportunities, we looked at the petroleum wholesalers category and found specific sites relating to the industry, and they were primarily LNG or oil terminals in coastal regions, also in Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And these categories seem to clearly apply to both the storage and transport of oil and natural gas. So it was unclear why a category like this would not qualify, and to what extent the guidance is using the discretion of the secretary rather than the literal interpretation of the language in order to make these categorizations. One final note, and this is more getting into the minutia, but the IRS did not provide a data source for the total number of employed persons per MSA, which complicates the process of replicating their approach. And they'll need to provide this at some further point. Direct employment is basically you take the number of people who are employed in fossil fuel categories divided by everybody who's employed, but they don't give you that sense of how to calculate everyone who's employed. And there's separate data sets with pretty significant differences in that total number of employment. So that's something we hope to see in future guidance. Potentially one of the most interesting findings of today, following the guidance last Tuesday, we replicated their methodology and we found a significantly different extent. We used the NAICS codes, the 8 NAICS codes that they listed, and aggregated them by the counties that were tracked to specific MSAs and non-MSAs. And from that, it actually appears that the IRS overestimates the total extent of energy communities. So it may be difficult to see, but the orange dashed lines there show what we found to qualify given their methodology. And the blue without the orange dash represents what is actually on that map. And so further clarity is required on, one, the total employment, as that might have been a factor for some of our differences, but also the exact data source and method they used for NAICS code delineation. So at this time, I think we want to be careful not to say that the IRS was wrong per se, but that there is definitely a need for further diligence on this topic, and it should be monitored closely. So one case study we have on this topic is Pocatello, Idaho, which is a metropolitan statistical area which showed no direct employment under the listed NAICS codes. However, the DOE maps show this as qualifying. This is rather confusing and sort of throws shade at the entire fossil fuel employment maps that are currently being provided. I think what this indicates is, one, that there can't be a lot of certainty in the DOE maps at this time, and also further research and transparency from those government data sources are required. A second example sort of shows the converse of the first. So where Pocatello, Idaho qualified under the DOE calculations, but did not qualify under our replication study, some areas which seem very likely to satisfy the direct employment requirement were not included. One of those is Las Vegas. And as you can see below, they include things like oil and gas pipeline and related structures construction, and natural gas distribution, almost 1,000 in each category. And those were not included in the DOE methodology, but we think highly relate to fossil fuel employment. So it was surprising that it was not included. It also could indicate that future guidance would include some additional NAICS codes and allow new regions to qualify. So everything I just discussed was direct employment data, and that is used to understand which regions have the chance of qualifying as a statistical area. However, another realm of uncertainty is the unemployment rate, because any MSA that has a direct employment rate above the 0.17% threshold also has to have an unemployment rate above the national average for the previous year. And so here, Treasury did provide clear guidance on the data sets required to calculate these unemployment rates. And our preliminary assessment of their map, and again, this does not include our replication study. This is just taking at face value that the DOE was correct in their initial map releases, which areas would qualify. And it's about half of them, actually a little more than half. But again, long-term understanding of unemployment rates could help get a better sense of, over time, which areas are likely to shift in qualification. Another important component of the unemployment rate is understanding what the previous year actually means. And the Treasury did provide helpful guidance on defining that previous year category. So as we show below, annual county unemployment rates aren't released until a couple months into each year. So to compare to the previous year, that timeline will actually start around April or May. The year 2023 is an exception because January to April is sort of bundled in with the 2022 county level unemployment data, which hasn't yet been released. But going forward, when the date at which that county level unemployment data set is released, then until the next annual release will be used to calculate the previous year calendar year unemployment rate. And so I hope I'm explaining that well, but it may just require digesting the slide a bit, and happy to answer more questions again at the end. So finally, the key takeaways from this statistical areas category are that they provide a substantial opportunity, but there are significant regulatory challenges, and they'll need to be tracked closely. The key finding here was our replication of their NAICS codes did not show the same map, and it raises questions on whether or not there are actually errors at this time. And so, further research and data review will probably be required before a final determination can be made. I think it's helpful for folks to also have a clear understanding of regional unemployment dynamics, as those unemployment rates will change from year to year, to help best track your project's likelihood of qualifying over time. Again, there's similar issues with tax equity arrangements in the face of this uncertainty. And for the unemployment rate, choosing the ITC or PTC could be different if a project's location will split in and out of qualification based on that regional unemployment rate. So I think I was able to get through that in under 30 minutes, but I'll bring it back to Pat, who can sort of discuss the forward-looking view of how these energy communities might change over time.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So before we turn it over to the Q&A and discussion section, we just want to give a little bit of perspective with that baseline on how things might change over time, what you might consider tracking, and when you're making decisions about project development or considering PTC versus ITC, what are those evolving energy community risks and uncertainties that you have to keep in mind? So I think there's really two categories here. Number one is just rule-based changes. So as per the letter of the law, things can change over time. So the law indicates that in order to qualify, the unemployment rate, as Ryan just outlined, for a specific MSA or NMSA has to be higher than the national average. And that is not a static data point. So every year you're going to get a new view on which parts of the country qualify for that. Similarly, the law states that coal mine or coal unit retirements open up qualifying areas. So as we look into the future over the next decade or so, there are likely to be several additional units or mines that go out of service that could open up qualification areas for that. And then on the brownfield front, as Ryan outlined, specific environmental site assessments that are conducted can clarify the qualification of a specific geography under the rule-based change. Second pathway is less certain, and it really gets to the guidance itself and some of the uncertainties in the guidance that Ryan just went through there. So we have a good start here and some good information from the Treasury Department, but there's a lot of questions that remain. So it's possible that the NAICS methodology and the NAICS labor codes could change over time, either through review of the initial list and further comments that people are offering to the Treasury Department, and those maps that have been preliminarily published could change. Or at some point in the future, a future administration, given some of the discretion to the secretary language that Ryan referenced, could also alter the qualifying codes. So something to keep in mind from a risk perspective. And then underlying updates to the data set. So I think Ryan said a couple times that the guidance has indicated that the EIA and the MSHA data sets are really going to be relied upon. And if there are errors in those data sets, which we are aware of several, those have to be corrected in order for the Treasury Department and the IRS to rule one way or another on a qualification, or in essence, for that data to flow through the maps and the data sets that Treasury will be producing. So there's some uncertainty there in terms of how those agencies will either work together or take comment or make updates to data sets in order to flow through the process here. So I think looking forward, as we track this, these are really several items that have to be monitored into the future. So a few examples. I think the biggest one is around the annual unemployment rate. So as Ryan outlined, we've got this clear schedule, at least every April or at the end of April, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics finalizes the annual unemployment data from the prior year. We will have a new 12-month window of potential qualification. And there is variance, as you can imagine, year to year on that qualification category. So there's two hurdles associated with this pathway. Obviously, you have to be in an area that has a certain amount of fossil fuel employment above that 0.17%, but that's only half the battle there. You have to also have an unemployment rate higher than the national average. So as an illustration here, we looked at 2021 versus 2022 data. And although the maps look quite similar on their face, if you look a little closer, you'll find areas that switched from green to red or from red to green, meaning that from year to year, those counties or MSA aggregates would have changed. So if you're developing in an area that moves into qualification or moves out of qualification, you have to be aware of the potential risks there and potentially look at the timing of begin construction safe harbor to ensure if you're in a qualifying area that you secure that from a tax credit perspective. The lightest shaded areas tend to be those that probably have the most uncertainty and could flip back and forth. And we've found a few areas that have flipped recently. So if we go to the next slide, just as an example of that, the West Central Illinois non-metropolitan area over the last 4 years has flipped in and out of qualification. So the graphic there on the bottom left shows the local unemployment rate relative to the national unemployment rate. And in this particular example, if you just look back 2019 through 2022, 2 of the years, the region would have qualified, assuming other qualification associated with the fossil employment data set itself, and 2 of the years it would not have. So lots of natural fluctuation that's going to occur based on the tracking of the unemployment data, and it really emphasizes the need to be on top of the data, perhaps tracking things monthly and being in position to understand when qualification is more likely or when there's a question mark about the annual data possibly flipping the situation. Another straightforward example of a rule-based change would be additional coal power plant closures. So the map here demonstrates all those areas that have not qualified under energy community provisions, census tract in proximity to a retired coal plant, but could, just based on the pure fact that there is an existing coal plant in that region. So the green and yellow areas have announced retirement dates, and as we know, that's often very dynamic. Utilities or asset owners are looking at retirement dates in the future. Those could be accelerated, those could be delayed, and then the red areas are active plants that don't, at least from an EIA data set perspective, have an announced retirement date within them. So again, these are large areas of land that, if a retirement were to occur or be announced, open up potential opportunities. So just within the letter of the law, if you will, there's a lot of geographical potential from the coal mine and coal plant in this particular example data sets. Then beyond those rule-based changes, as I mentioned, there's guidance uncertainty. So I think Ryan did a fairly thorough job of outlining some of the questions that we have in terms of the NAICS codes that qualify and the data sets that the IRS is using to come up with the 0.17% ratio that gets you into the qualification threshold. But this example just gives a quick illustration of how impactful just adding one NAICS code could be to the geographic extent that qualifies. So this is not specific to the latest Treasury guidance, but under some work that we've done on what we categorize as our strict interpretation case, the light blue shading shows areas that would qualify with those 7 or so codes that we had identified. And if you were to simply add one code in the petroleum wholesaler space, you could have all that additional land qualify under the dark blue area. So again, just making the point that tracking the guidance as it comes out, being active with understanding and potentially petitioning for different code qualification or getting more rationale from Treasury on why areas are in or out is going to be important as we go forward. And then final slide here gets to the coal plant and mine areas, and this is the MSHA data set in particular. I think Ryan noted this before, but we have identified in our scrub of this data set several areas that just have some uncertainty and discrepancy. Mines and plants are sometimes listed incorrectly, either from a geographic mapping perspective or from a status perspective on being fully shut down or closed versus non-producing. And being able to track this and understand if there is a data error, or understand what the implication would be if EIA or MSHA were to make an update is probably very important going forward. So I'll just wrap up with some final thoughts here. I think there's a few things that I think would be takeaways in general. The energy communities clearly are providing substantial opportunity for the renewable and storage sector. But the constant shifts to, or the constant potential for shift in qualifying territory will really require a lot of diligence from developers, utilities, investors in this space. From a closure perspective, as Ryan outlined, the guidance provides very clear, traceable definitions, but there's data cleanup that may be warranted through MSHA and EIA. And I think if you're in an area where the data is unclear, there's action there to take to try to get those underlying data sets updated if there are issues. On the statistical area, fossil fuel employment domain, we outlined several big questions, I think, that exist on not only the methodology itself, but the data sets that are underlying that methodology. And we need a little bit more guidance to get very confident on where that will finally play out. And then obviously this area has a lot of year-to-year volatility risk, and just something to think about as you track specific projects. And then finally, on the brownfields, the guidance, as Ryan outlined, is clearer for qualification. And I think there's a lot of opportunity that will develop, particularly in the storage space, where you can be modular and site in areas that may qualify from a brownfield perspective. So we have several questions that come in, and we'll try to use the last 10 minutes here to address those. So I'm going to start with a couple that had come in via the RSVP links. So thanks for sending a couple in advance. First one was related to translating some of this information to electricity market modeling. So the question is, any advice on how to incorporate qualifying sites into geographically detailed electricity models? So I think that's a very good question, and something we've been thinking about as we look at fundamental long-term capacity expansion analysis and views on how the IRA is going to impact new builds in the power sector. And I think the advice we would give is that it's probably impossible to try to get the geographical detail associated with census tracts and MSAs into power sector models, but understanding the potential in some big regions is critical. So as we outlined on some of these maps, areas like ERCOT, parts of PJM, parts of the West have really large land area that could be eligible for bonus credits. And in power market models, ignoring that is probably going to overstate the potential cost of new renewable or storage resources. So it's certainly not a slam dunk that every project in those key areas is going to be available. But one technique that we've been thinking about is try to have buckets of new build options in those electricity models that can be qualifying resources from a bonus credit perspective, and vary the amount of qualifying resources based on the percentage of land that may exist based on this type of analysis. So a lot of work probably to do there, but hopefully that provides a little bit of guidance. A couple questions came in on the construction start and qualification, and maybe Ryan, I'll turn these over to you. So I think there's two here that are related. First question is, for projects that already started construction prior to 2023 but have not hit COD, what year of unemployment data should they reference to qualify as an energy community? And then similarly, can projects currently under construction, i.e. started last year with an expected in-service date this year, qualify for the ITC adder, assuming it's located in an energy community? So I think you kind of hit on some of that, Ryan, when you kicked off the section, but might be worth maybe getting into a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah, so for the first question, if the beginning of construction date is prior to 2023, then for the ITC, it can still qualify if the place in service date is a date at which that location qualifies as an energy community. The unemployment rate won't be compared to that beginning of construction date. Rather, it'll be compared to that place in service date year. And then for the PTC, if your beginning construction date is before 2023, then you'll be subject to an annual review. So for each taxable year, it'll be assessed whether or not that area that your project was in qualified as an energy community, and you'll receive the credits on a case-by-case basis for each year based on whether or not that area is an energy community. And then I think for the second question, if the place in service date is this year, but the BOC is prior to 2023, for the ITC, it should qualify if the place in service date, if at the place in service date, your project is an energy community. But for the PTC, you'll again be subject to that annual review, and you won't have certainty of qualifying for the entire 10-year credit period.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, hopefully that answers that. There were a few questions that came in on the coal to natural gas conversion. I think you touched on this, Ryan, but maybe we can just read a couple of the questions here. Do you have any sense of eligibility for coal generators that are converted to natural gas, which I think we did talk about, but then maybe more of an open-ended question. What are the chances the IRS listens to input from CRA and or others on revising the must-be coal at time of retirement guidelines? So perhaps, Ryan, you could just re-emphasize what the current guidance indicates, and then any perspectives on what people might consider doing to get a reconsideration, or at least raise the question to be certain on that.
Yeah, those are good questions. I think the current guidance clearly states that coal to gas conversions do not qualify. But to us, our slides on that merely raise the question that if a unit retires or converts to gas, it will never be allowed to be considered as retired, even if the gas unit retires itself. So I also mentioned that this guidance had a section for comment, but it only pertained to the tax revenue portion of the statistical area category, which is a rather niche topic. So we're not sure if there will be further guidance or this is final, and the future updates will only pertain to tax revenue in statistical area categories. But I would assume, based on the errors that we've identified, and more broadly, some of the issues in their methodology, that further clarification could resolve this issue. So I don't know if we have the best idea of what the pathways are for advocating for that, but potentially in the comment section of the tax revenue guidance that could be provided. Other pathways might need to be used, though.
Yeah, thanks. I think there was a somewhat related question just about whether do you think that there will be legal challenges to the maps given the issues identified with them? And I think that's tough to answer with certainty, but the analysis that we've done, at least, I think raises the question that it's possible, and there's probably a few angles here. One may just be a data quality question, which likely is more of an administrative and data transparency in interaction with the right agencies. But it's possible that there could be broader legal challenges around the definition, and I don't want to comment specifically on the pathway there, but for example, I think as Ryan was outlining, the letter of the law is fairly clear about defining the types of labor or labor categories that would go into energy community bonus qualification, and there could be a pathway to challenge the interpretation from the agency on how the NAICS codes map to that. I think agencies and The secretary has a lot of deference here as per the law as well, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are some efforts to look at that from a legal perspective. A couple quick questions on brownfields. Ryan, these might be ones that we follow up separately, but was there clarity on the amount of contaminated land that has to be on the site to be a brownfield? And another questioner asked, are landfill projects all confirmed to qualify, or will there be additional requirements? So if you have anything to add on those, Ryan, please do.
I mean, I think the guidance basically says that if your environmental site assessment finds the presence of a contaminant that is a qualifying contaminant under the IRA brownfield definition, then it would qualify. So it's not clear if there has to be contamination found scattered throughout the site or at one specific spot. And again, I think working with environmental consulting groups with sort of this expertise on site remediation will be key to understanding that opportunity. Regarding landfills, there may be exclusions if it's a Superfund site or if the contamination profile doesn't match the specific brownfield definition. But in our review, many landfills are considered brownfields under the IRA definition. So there will likely be lots of opportunities there.
All right, I think there's one more unanswered question, and it's maybe a good one to close with. It's kind of an open-ended question, but maybe some final thoughts at this stage where Treasury is seeking guidance on the remaining uncertain elements. And I think Ryan just noted where they've only explicitly asked for further comment on one area, but if Treasury were to seek guidance more generally, what are the most important recommendations to make? So maybe some final thoughts on that, Ryan.
Yeah, I think you can break it down by the statistical area first. First, I think they need to provide a lot of transparency on their data sets and methodology so they can be replicable. I think it's a big issue if you go into their CBP or county business patterns data set and do the aggregations independently and find a different result. So understanding the issue there. Again, we mentioned the total unemployment data source was not defined, which it was critical. So that's the data perspective. And then with NAICS codes, it would be really helpful to understand a rationale or justification for why it is selected and how it adheres to the IRA verbiage, and also why certain NAICS codes were excluded. And that could probably temper some of the legal obstacles facing these sites. On the coal side, I think, again, the big issue is location data errors for the MSHA and EIA data set. And it may become burdensome for those organizations which are not really set up to sort of take requests or take comments on their location data. So, potentially a portal or a streamlined way to understand those errors and correct them would be really helpful, I think, to de-risk that opportunity going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And I think we've hit the top of the hour here. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. There were a couple questions about the recording. So this webinar has been recorded, and we will be providing a link to those attendees that have signed up so that you can listen to it or get it, listen to it again on your own time or pass it to others. And please feel free to reach out to us with any questions or comments if we can provide any other information, or if we can share the slides here, we'd be happy to do so. So thanks for everyone's time today. Appreciate the attendance and all the good questions, and have a good rest of your day.